For years, Apple has been the lone holdout in a sea of all-screen phones with punch-hole cutouts that house selfie cameras. The black rectangle that's set at the top of its flagships since the iPhone X has drawn some criticism, but mostly ambivalence. Apple has kept it around in large part because Face ID requires sophisticated cameras that can't easily be downsized. Meanwhile, Android phones have either used punch-hole cutouts or moved on to under-display cameras, aided by the adoption of in-screen fingerprint scanners. With the iPhone 14 Pro, Apple is leaving the notch behind and using a pill-shaped cutout instead to house its front cameras. But it's not just changing up the hardware and calling it a day. The company also uses software and animations to make the cutout feel more useful and better integrated into the interface than on Android phones. In true Apple fashion, the company is also giving this feature a fancy name, Dynamic Island. Leave it to Apple to be late to the party, do things a little differently, and slap its branding all over it. The Dynamic Island isn't the only example of Apple adopting a feature late but doing it its way. The iPhone 14 Pros also bring a 48-megapixel camera system and always-on displays that show your entire lock screen instead of a simplified interface. Add emergency SOS via satellites and the removal of the physical SIM tray, and the iPhone 14 Pros feel like significant upgrades. Giant pill-shaped hole aside, they don't actually look that much different from their predecessors. The new models are a minuscule 0.01 inches thicker and a hair shorter than last year's. The non-Max Pro also added a bit of weight, 0.07 ounces or 2 grams to be exact. The Max still feels like a massive brick of a phone that could crack your skull open if it fell while you were reading in bed. But if you've used previous models, you know what you're in for. From the back, the iPhone 13 Pro and 14 Pro look basically identical, and you can only sort of tell them apart by the fact that the latest model's cameras are ever so slightly bigger. You can also eyeball their edges to find the SIM card tray. In the US, the iPhone 14 lineup no longer supports physical cards. The most significant visible difference between the iPhone 14 Pro and the last generation is that notch. By ensuring the camera is always camouflaged by software, Apple is giving us a sort of faux full-screen experience, but it's also being somewhat useful. When nothing is happening in the space, the hole is still obvious, especially when you're watching a full-screen video. It's smaller than the notch, sure, but when I was switching between the iPhone 14 and the Pro, I didn't notice a big difference. But things happen when you start a timer or play a song, for example. When you swipe up to go to the home screen, an animation shows the app jumping into the island, which stretches a little to make room for a clock or album cover on the left, while a countdown or a dancing waveform sits on the right. Tap the island and it'll take you back to the app. Long press it, and the box expands further to show you more controls. It's not much easier or faster than swiping down from the top to access the playback box, but I guess this way there's an obvious indicator something is happening. The animations throughout this experience too are slick, making everything feel polished and thought through. Most apps already avoid the notch area on iOS, but every now and then something trickles through. On Telegram, for example, part of a blue badge peeps out above the pill. When multiple activities are taking place at once, the island splits into two, forming a horizontal exclamation point. I need to spend more than a week with the iPhone 14 Pro to know how much of an impact the dynamic island would make on my life. But for now, the biggest effect is aesthetic. Seeing the pill change into a square when signing into an app or Apple Pay with Face ID, as well as the turn right arrow appear when I'm navigating somewhere, is a nice touch. In general, notifications also feel neater, in part because it's a persistent space now instead of a translucent box that slides in and out from the top. The fact that it's a black box with text in colorful font also makes it easier to see. Dynamic Island aside, Apple hasn't changed that much about the iPhone 14 Pro's screen resolution. You'll still find a 6.1-inch and 6.7-inch Super Retina XDR panel on the Pro and Pro Max respectively, and they support ProMotion for refresh rates of up to 120Hz. Although they both pack slightly more pixels than their predecessors, the Pro still offers the same density at 460 ppi, while the Pro Max is a slight 2 ppi higher than before. But Apple did make the displays brighter. They can hit up to 2000 nits outdoors and 1600 nits indoors when playing HDR video. I did have a slightly easier time reading things off the iPhone 14 Pro than on the 13 Pro, although the difference isn't significant. On the surface, the always-on display, or AOD, might not seem like a huge change, but a lot has been done under the hood to make it work well without overtaxing the battery. It also made a new low power supply for the AOD and uses a dedicated coprocessor that updates the screen without having to tap the CPU. For things that change predictably, like the clock or countdown, the system pre-renders frames and feeds them to the AOD when needed. Finally, using the proximity sensor, which is now behind the display, the AOD is turned off when it detects occlusion, like when you flip your phone face down or stick it in your purse or pocket. While Samsung and Pixel phones give you a black and white screen showing just the clock, date, and weather along with a row of indicator icons, Apple actually presents your full lock screen, complete with wallpaper and widget support. And by the way, if you're concerned about privacy or you just don't like the AOD, you can turn it off in display settings. All iPhone 14s, Pro or not, will be able to connect to satellites, so you can send emergency messages when cell or Wi-Fi signals aren't available. This feature is rolling out in November in the US, so it's not something I was able to test. But based on demos I saw and tested on Apple's campus, this feature is intriguing and could really help you out when you're in a pinch. Light crash detection is something that you don't want to have to use, but it's good to have in times of crisis. All iPhone 14 models do away with a physical SIM tray altogether. The problem is, I'm not sure we have the infrastructure yet. Apple may be a bit premature in getting rid of the SIM card tray, but it could give US carriers the push they need to adopt the format. Apple has offered eSIM support since the iPhone XR in 2018, and the company says it's had a lot of adoption growth. With the iPhone 13 last year, Apple started using eSIM as the primary method of activation in all US retail stores too. Now in general, setting up my review unit service was painless. All I had to do was wait 2 minutes for Verizon to activate my line. Apple also offers the option of converting my existing physical card to a digital one without having to leave my apartment. It's funny that Apple has thrown caution to the wind and fully embraced eSIM before it adopted USB-C. The charging standard is more prevalent and would make many people's lives more convenient. This is one area where the iPhone 14 Pro feels stuck in the past. With a new 48-megapixel primary sensor, updated low-light processing algorithm called Photonic Engine, and new features like Action Mode for improved video stabilization, the iPhone 14 Pro's cameras promise a meaty upgrade. But in my testing so far, the changes feel minor. In fact, most of the photos I took from the iPhone 14 Pro and 13 Pro are basically indistinguishable. All three phones were adept at keeping details crisp, even in shadows. The lines inside the roof of a shelter were sharp when I magnified the pictures. When I used a telephoto lens to zoom into 3 times though, the iPhone 14 Pro produced the brightest image. It also delivered the punchiest colors on some graffiti under an overpass. However, sometimes the iPhone 14 Pro actually does worse than the 13 Pro and Pixel. In my shots of a park, the 14 Pro had the least saturated greens and looked a little washed out. In general, the quad bitting of the 48-megapixel sensor doesn't seem to drastically improve image quality, at least in daylight. A similar story can be told of the cameras in low light. In one example, the iPhone 14 Pro's shots had the most accurate color and cleanest details, beating the Pixel 6 Pro at capturing the individual lines on a leaf. But Google's flagship did a better job with a picture of a bright bar in a dim restaurant. It clearly captured individual leaves on a potted plant on a shelf, while the same part of the picture was shrouded in shadow when shot with the 14 Pro. The Pixel also took generally brighter nightscapes of Manhattan, with the iPhone 14 Pro coming in very close behind, and differences boiled down to minor variations in color temperature. I still prefer the Pixel for portrait shots though. While the iPhone 14 Pro's new focal length of 24mm is supposed to be better for portraits, it still isn't as adept as Google at picking out subjects and blurring out the background. I used all 3 phones to snap a friend chilling with one leg up on a park bench, and the Pixel was the best at keeping the scar on his knee in crisp detail. In general, most people comparing the iPhone 13 Pro and 14 Pro won't notice a major difference in picture quality. But advanced users will appreciate the ability to shoot 48 megapixel images in ProRAW, which will allow them to capture greater detail. Video is another area that got an improvement too, with support now for up to 4K resolution and 30 frames per second in cinematic mode. I don't usually shoot clips that sharp, but the footage I got of a dog chasing a frisbee around came out smooth and vivid. I also checked out action mode by chasing my friend up and down a path, recording both with and without the new stabilization feature. I did notice slight improvements, but frankly, Apple was already delivering impressively stable footage. The same can be said for selfies taken with the true depth camera up front. In general, the iPhone 14 Pro's pictures here came out slightly brighter than the 13 Pro's, and although autofocus is a new feature, I haven't noticed a big improvement. In selfies where I was headbanging or where a friend was fidgeting, both the iPhone 13 and 14 Pro delivered crisp shots. The changes to the iPhone 14 Pro's cameras aren't a dramatic jump from last year's model, but anyone looking to upgrade from an iPhone 12 Pro or older is likely to find the latest flagship a satisfying improvement. As expected, the iPhone 14 Pro and Pro Max are smooth, well-tuned machines that can handle any task thrown at them. Apple's new A16 Bionic chip handled my massive selfie binges while playing Spotify in the background, alongside concurrent timers, maps navigation, and more. In the brief time I've had the iPhone 14 Pro, it's gotten warm, but not uncomfortably so, which is more than I can say for my year-old Pixel 6 Pro and iPhone 12. In spite of the always-on display, I also haven't noticed a battery running perilously low, even after a long day starting with a 10 a.m. workout followed by numerous camera test sessions and a night out. One night, I forgot to charge the iPhone 14 Pro and had to run to a morning workout with just 19% in the tank. It still lasted more than an hour, and I was even able to do some testing. From the outside, the iPhone 14 Pro and Pro Max don't look dramatically different from their predecessors, aside from the dynamic island. But thanks to the always-on display and crisis preparedness features like crash detection and emergency SOS via satellite, the iPhone 14 Pros feel more useful in a variety of scenarios. Sure, the camera updates feel less significant than I expected, but anyone upgrading from an older phone will appreciate what Apple has to offer. For more in-depth reviews of smartphones, wearables, and laptops, make sure you subscribe to Engadget. And as always, thank you for watching.